Welcome back to another episode of Bitfinex Talks. I'm your host, Ricardo Martinez. Today, my guest is Jesse Knutson, who is the head of operations. Did I butcher that?
You almost got it. You're very close. Knutson.
Knutson. All right. Well, Jesse Knutson, head of operations for Bitfinex Securities. Jesse, thanks for coming on the show. Sorry to butcher your name.
No problem. Ricardo, good to be here. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the interesting things about working for a decentralized company like, Bitfinex is that we've got employees around the world, and then we can just take turns butchering each other's names.
Yeah, no, it's like that sometimes. The reason I asked you to come on the show was because Bitfinex Securities is celebrating its second anniversary tomorrow. I wanted to ask you about your experience so far as head of operations for Bitfinex Securities. Starting off with my first question, which would be, what do you think is the most important lesson you've learned so far in 2 years of operations?
Yeah, it's been 2 years, but it feels like 100, right? So it feels like a lot has happened in that 2 years. I think probably what has surprised me the most is the number and quality of opportunities available to us in what have been markets that have been kind of traditionally overlooked by traditional finance. So I'm thinking about places like Latin America and Central Asia. So part of our thesis for the business is the idea of banking the unbanked. That's kind of a cliche within financial technology as it applies to individuals, but we think that also applies to countries and even whole regions, and also classes of companies and assets, right? So it's difficult for small, medium enterprises to raise money or to get the attention of global investment banks and to kind of access global capital markets. So it's encouraging for us to kind of continually be updated with data points that support our thesis. So, we've had conventional securities exchanges, we've had constituents of the legacy system, investment banks and brokers, all looking to us to explore tokenization. We've had a lot of interest, even at the national level, from government-owned enterprises across Central Asia and also within Latin America, and interest also from a lot of very mainstream conventional issuers and even listed companies that are listed in G7 and in major financial centers, looking to explore tokenization and to do security token issuances. And then outside of that, I think, this view that we've had for a number of years about the benefits of tokenization and how this represents a technological upgrade to legacy markets, for that view to become more of a consensus view over time. So if you look at the news recently, we see a lot of comments from leaders of traditional conventional capital markets like BlackRock and Larry Fink talking about security tokenization. So I think encouragingly, that's increasingly becoming a consensus view. So I think all of this is very encouraging. And I think generally I've been surprised at the amount of interest from traditional players in the capital markets ecosystem that are now looking towards the technology behind security tokenization.
I agree. It's been very surprising at how quickly some of the large players like BlackRock, which you mentioned, and others have been, first they scorned this technology and blockchain, and now they're changing their tune and looking to adopt it pretty aggressively. Tell us some of the recent milestones that you've accomplished lately with Bitfinex Securities. I know that you guys were the first to get a digital assets license in El Salvador. Yeah. And recently in Astana, you guys opened a regional office. Can you tell us a little bit about those kind of things?
Yeah, I think so. Taking a step back and looking at the platform more broadly, we're one of only a handful of companies globally that's licensed to do this business. And then within that small group, we're part of an even smaller group that's licensed and regulated to do that in more than one jurisdiction. So both primary market issuances and then to support secondary market trading as well. So we were the first global digital asset platform to be licensed in El Salvador under their new digital asset regime. And that was certainly one of our big accomplishments of the last year. And then also, as you mentioned, establishing our office in the AIFC, the Astana International Financial Center, which is a financial center like Dubai's DIFC based in Kazakhstan. And then getting some dedicated headcount there to pursue opportunities within Central Asia and then also just kind of globally, really. And I think some of the partnerships that we've also focused on and made over the last 12 months have been milestones. So Specifically, I'm thinking of an MOU that we did with a financial services provider in Central Asia called Skybridge Capital. We're working on a number of projects with them. And I think partnering with some of these traditional players within conventional finance are going to be a big, they're going to be a way for us to access not only more traditional investors, but also to help build up our pipeline of issuances for companies within the region that are looking to do security tokenization. Another really exciting one was our MOU with the Astana International Exchange. So that's the conventional securities exchange within the AIFC. I think that's probably a first of its kind. I don't know of any other security tokenization platform that's created a relationship with a conventional securities exchange. So what we're doing there is working on doing dual listings. So issuers on their platform or on our platform could issue conventional securities and tokenized securities at the same time, and then have a conversion mechanism between the two so that you could flip back and forth between the two. And kind of the benefit there, I think, for traditional issuers is that you'll be able to access global liquidity and all the benefits within security tokenization, things like 24/7 trading, real-time settlement, global liquidity. And for me, that's an updated version of the ADR or GDR model that's that a lot of listed companies in Asia or Central Asia pursue to get access to global investors, and I think is very, very unique. We've also built up a pretty strong pipeline, and I think we've got a lot of exciting stuff that's going to be announced later in this year. So I think a lot of the action this year is probably going to be skewed towards the fourth quarter. We've got new issuances that I think will probably get approved and announced at Plan B. We'll probably be announcing them later in the fourth quarter. And I think El Salvador is probably going to start to get going in the fourth quarter as well. So I think we're going to have a lot of our big milestones are probably going to come towards the end of the year.
One of the things you just mentioned that I think is pretty exciting is these kind of instruments that don't exist in the traditional markets. This hybrid issuance that you're talking about, that's really exciting. Are there other new types of investments that you kind of foresee on the horizon?
So I don't think that necessarily is a new investment. Like I said, I think it's basically an upgraded model of GDRs or ADRs. So, my background is in traditional finance. I used to be head of equity capital solutions for Macquarie here in Taiwan. I'm based in Taiwan. And for Asian issuers, the ADR or GDR route is a well-beaten path to get access to global investors. So if you're a big Asian company like Foxconn, which does iPhone assembly, or Samsung or someone like that, and you want to get access to, or TSMC, which does semiconductors, if you want to get access to European or American investors and have an issuance that trades on their trading hours, not Asian trading hours, then historically you go to some place like LSE or to Luxembourg or do an ADR in the US. And I kind of see STOs for listed companies as a really similar kind of concept. And the idea is to get global liquidity, but that we can do that much better. That we can get truly global liquidity that's not just in the US or not just in Europe, but that's truly global. And then we have all those other benefits for investors, like things that we're very much used to as users of the Bitfinex platform. Things like 24/7, 365 liquidity, right? So in Taiwan, we have trading hours. We trade, 9 a.m. until 1:30, and then, there's no trading on Chinese New Year's. There's no trading on weekends, and then real-time settlement, which is, I think, a massive one that maybe is slightly overlooked in the benefits that it can bring traditional investors and traders. So in Taiwan, if you're selling your TSMC on Friday, we have T+2 settlement. So you sell it on Friday, you don't get your cash until next week. So for traditional investors, if they can trade this tokenized version of a publicly listed company, it trades 24/7, 365. You just get so much more control over your asset, and you're so much better able to manage risk and manage your capital. As soon as you sell your tokenized, if there was a tokenized TSMC, as soon as you sell it, you get your cash right away. And you can use that cash to do something else. You can pull that cash off the platform for risk management reasons. So there's just a ton of benefits. So I think most of what we're doing isn't, really new. It's just taking the technology from the digital asset industry that I think has really been battle tested over the last 10 years, and then applying that to capital markets.
What sort of timeline do you see for this sort of rollout of this technology to be adopted by these traditional markets globally? Like, do you see this as like kind of a rollout like the internet where it's been over, 30, 40 years, or do you kind of see it hyper Bitcoinizing, so to speak, as far as like them all adopting tokens for securities and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think the way it's going to develop is I think we just need more proof of concepts in the model in the market. So we still only have one asset on the platform, the blockstream mining node. I think that's probably the flagship product for the whole security token industry. They did 8 tranches, raised $50 million, so they did fairly decent size, and it's properly tokenized. And what I mean by that is that you're able to pull the tokens off the platform, you're able to self-custody them, you're even able to trade them peer-to-peer, and you're able to do all of that because it's in a whitelisted ecosystem. So that lets us kind of tick our regulatory, our KYC AML box, and then also gives users a really low friction experience. So I think we need more proof of concepts, and then that will gradually build, and then we'll get more investors into the ecosystem. And I think along that path, there's going to be events where we see quantum leaps in adoption, where things just kind of like jump up very sharply. I think El Salvador, when that comes online, will certainly be one of those events because we've got a pretty robust pipeline there. But when we're thinking about, how does this get broadly adopted, and what does that even mean? Does that mean that G7 countries, major financial centers, the NASDAQ are embracing this technology? I'm a little bit more pessimistic on that. I think that this opportunity is probably inherently skewed to small to mid-sized economies, simply because there's so much more upside for them and there's basically no downside. So if you look at Kazakhstan, where the AIFC is based, financial services are like 4% of their GDP. So there's, and in El Salvador, I'm guessing it's probably less than 2%. So it's all upside for them. They've got nothing to lose by trying this. And kind of the pitch for them is that, maybe we could become the Singapore of Latin America. Maybe we could become the Singapore of Central Asia, and we could take that, 2 or 4% of GDP and ramp it up to 20 or 30%. And then you look at the perspective of major financial centers who already have a leading position in capital markets. And there's just so much more pushback from large, powerful incumbents, from the central depository, from the custodians, from the brokers, from the paying agents, from all of those constituents of the legacy system that we're trying to disintermediate, right? So I think this is really an opportunity for places like the AIFC, for places like El Salvador, to compete asymmetrically with major financial centers. If you're El Salvador and you're trying to compete against London, Tokyo, New York, it's a slog. It's not going to happen. But if you can embrace this technology and come at it asymmetrically, I think there's an opportunity not only to close the gap with capital markets, major financial centers, but also to leverage this technology to create brand new financial centers. And I think that's, so there's an exciting inclusivity story to what we're doing. But I think it will probably be a while before we see security tokens and that technology embraced in a meaningful way in G7 economies.
Since Bitfinex Securities is at the forefront of this industry right now, that's just started, aside from like the markets adopting these technologies, like what technologies do you see evolving like to carry this forward? Like, do you see this mostly as like a Bitcoin centric kind of thing that's on Liquid and other side chains, or do you see like other Web3 kind of chains possibly getting involved and also be candidates for issuance?
Yeah, so my background might slightly give away my bias. Having the white paper posted on your background is probably an indication that you're primarily Bitcoin focused. I normally explain the opportunity for STOs and kind of like that is dependent on 3 criteria. And I kind of present that as, number 1 is technology, number 2 is having investable assets, and number 3 is the one that's been kind of the slowest to develop and has been the most important, which is commercially viable regulatory oversight. On the technology side, I think we've got most of the pieces that we need there. So we've got platforms like Bitfinex, we've got platforms like Bitfinex Securities that have, years of experience, of operational experience, and that have maintained uptime of like, 99.999%. So on the exchange and the trading and the capital raise side, I think we're pretty well battle tested and kind of established the stability of the technology. And then more recently, maybe in the last, kind of 12 to 24 months, we've had issuance technologies like the Liquid network. And I kind of see the block stream mining node, as I mentioned previously, as like the flagship, the first really kind of like decent sized proof of concept for the industry. So I think on the technology side, we're fairly mature at the moment. I think there's other things that will need to develop over time and that people haven't tried yet that I think we need to try and see how it works out. Things like, on-chain dividend issuances. These are things that I think are very exciting. Like when you can make voting and dividend issuances very, very granular, so that it's very easy for people to vote on a very short time frame. And when you can do things like pay out dividends, not on an annual or quarterly basis, but what happens if you can start streaming them? Like what if you can get your dividends on a monthly, weekly, daily, hourly or minute basis? Then I think that's a really interesting change to capital markets. So those are the things that I think we have technology in place for now, but nobody has really pushed forward for it. I think another area that we're looking to improve at Bitfinex Securities is how issuers interact with the issuance protocol. So I think Liquid works fairly well already, but issuers, especially traditional issuers who are like brick and mortar, people who have done like a number of bond issuances, or you're a listed company somewhere, it's a real challenge for them to interact with some of this technology. So I think making that a little bit more user friendly is another thing that we need to do. But largely, I think the technology itself is fairly mature. It's just a matter of tweaking it, making it more user friendly, and then trying different applications.
You mentioned that Bitfinex Securities is focused on Central Asia and Latin America through the regional office in Kazakhstan and also the office in El Salvador. But what other hotspots do you see as far as like jurisdictions or regions for security tokens besides those two?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's constantly a lot of news about this, throughout Asia, the Middle East. I think a lot of it, when you dig into the details, I think that there's a lot of smoke and mirrors out there. But certainly, our licensing team headed by Giles Dixon, very active in exploring these various regions and trying to find the ones that are the most promising. I think also that once we start to get a little bit of momentum, and I think once El Salvador comes online, I think we're going to see a lot more jurisdictions that are very interesting in leveraging this technology. So that's why I think El Salvador is a really interesting proof of concept, because what's the path forward for emerging markets to not be emerging markets? Like what is the path for an emerging market to become a developed market? It's kind of really an open question. And I think, if El Salvador can navigate that path and they can start to build a promising capital markets infrastructure within the country, then I think there's going to be a lot more countries that are looking to them and looking to that example. And I think there'll be a lot of companies probably reaching out to us directly to see how we can help replicate that in their jurisdiction. So I'm really excited to see where that will be. I think we've got high hopes for Central Asia, Latin America, all the emerging markets, Africa, Asia. There's a lot of opportunity.
El Salvador's obviously got a huge first mover advantage with the Bitcoin legal tender law, and then also the digital asset law, like to create a regulatory framework for this kind of thing to be rolled out. But Kazakhstan is also like super open to these ideas. Like how far behind do you think that Kazakhstan is before we see something like comparable to what's going on in El Salvador?
Yeah, I think they're very different, right? So El Salvador is a dollarized economy, so I think it's easier for them to do something like, make Bitcoin legal tender. In places like Kazakhstan, the central banks are very influential. They have their own currency, the Kazakh tenge. So I think the idea of them, going on a Bitcoin standard is very slim at the moment. The regimes are slightly different in their approach. I think maybe where they're similar is they both look at this technology and they see it as a big opportunity. So Kazakhstan, of course, like historically has been a major mining hub. So they've been, in the top 3 for mining for a long time, for a number of years. When I was at Macquarie, one of the big accomplishments we did within the digital asset space was to make an equity investment into Bitfury in 2018. So I think that was probably maybe the first equity investment into a mining company by a major Western investment bank at that time. And back then, Kazakhstan was a big chunk of the global hash rate for Bitfury. I'm not sure how that's evolved over time. But kind of my point is that in Kazakhstan, they've seen, Bitcoin mining go from nothing to become like a big industry, right? And an industry that pays taxes and that can, contribute to the economic growth of the country, that can contribute to job growth. So in Kazakhstan and the AIFC, we don't really have these conversations about, what if Bitcoin goes to zero? What if Bitcoin doesn't work? I think they've seen that growth and how it can be accretive to the broader economy. And they're very interested in taking this technology and leveraging it to drive growth in capital markets. And I think that's also the approach in El Salvador too, where they understand from maybe a slightly different perspective how this technology can benefit them, and they're looking to do the same thing to apply it to capital market growth.
So El Salvador is basically like the ground zero for this, like in a real world experiment, so to speak. You mentioned that later this year that El Salvador is going to go into action. What do you mean by that? And what can people expect to see in El Salvador?
Yeah, so we're still waiting for the regulator to get up and running, and I think that's probably going to happen in a matter of weeks or months. And we'll be able to bring some of our pipeline to market. I think a lot of this, interestingly, is probably going to coincide with Plan B. So we're planning to have a number of announcements around Plan B. And I think it's going to be an interesting security token presence at Plan B. We're going to have a number of side events and panels talking about regulatory issuers. There's going to be a number of our issuers in the pipeline will be there, speak opportunities. And then on the technology, Adam will be there. There'll be a number of people from the blockchain team talking about liquidity, liquid, and how their technology is being used to facilitate security token issuances.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you about security tokens that you think is super important for our audience to know?
I think maybe, it's interesting to talk about what we're seeing on the issuer side. So we have, I think it's interesting to talk about what we see on the issuer side. So we have 2 issuances in the pipeline in the AIFC. I think that they'll probably come through. We should probably get regulatory approval in the next couple of weeks, and I plan to make an announcement around Plan B. So we'll have more issuances coming out there. Interestingly, in the AIFC, the interest from issuers seems to be skewed towards debt offerings. And I think there's a massive opportunity for that within the digital asset industry. If you look back at maybe the last, year or two, a lot of the big blowups within the industry have been driven by investors looking for yield, right? And then being pushed further and further out on the risk spectrum. So I think it's interesting if we can get some decently yielding debt products, things that yield like 10% or more, but that are issued as security tokens, right? So they have all the defined rights and obligations and transparency that come along with that. So I think it gives people solid yield within the industry, but also gives people a lot more transparency and clarity and protection. And kind of my thesis for a while has been that because our industry, the digital asset industry, is so high volatility, right? Like Bitcoin is like the lowest volatility asset within the space, which is kind of crazy. And I think that's part of the reason for the success of Tether and Tether Gold is that there's such a hunger for low volatility assets because everything else in the industry is so high volatility. That I think that there's a really unique niche for low volatility and then high yielding assets. So I think that could be a really interesting opportunity, and I'm really interested to see how the market will react to those. And then in El Salvador, it kind of runs the gamut a little bit more. So we've got issuers that are looking to do equity issuances. They're looking to do like kind of like an equity-like structure or debt-like as well, and then fund kind of type products as well. So it runs the gamut a little bit more, but again, it'll be interesting to see how investors react to some of these products that we have coming to market in the next couple of months.
You mentioned like mining companies, Blockstream, of course, with the mining node, and other crypto adjacent companies. But what's the response been from companies that are like outside of the crypto sphere?
Yeah, I think actually the highest quality issuances, the most interesting issuances that we have in the pipeline, some of them are kind of more conventional leaning. They're conventional issuers that have done a number of issuances in traditional markets already, and they're looking to apply this technology to what they already do. I think those are really exciting because they're typically more stable, lower volatility, and a lot of them have a decent yield attached to them as well. So I think those will be really exciting. I'm also excited to, I find it slightly disappointing that, the biggest companies in the space consistently, they're they grow up, they make money, they have revenues, and then they list on places like the NASDAQ, right? So that's most of the mining industry has done that. That's what Coinbase has done. And I hope to provide an alternative to our best companies in the space, right? So, what if Tether could do an STO? What if Blockstream could do an STO? So I hope to provide an alternative for the best companies in our space as well, so that we can keep more of our, our best companies within the ecosystem. So I think that'll be exciting as well. That's slightly longer term, but certainly we have, things like mining-based products in the pipeline, tokenized hash rate contracts. We've got equity in some smaller companies within the space. So there's a lot of that stuff that I think is going to develop over time and is super exciting.
One more question. My final question is, let's pretend for a second that El Salvador becomes like a financial powerhouse similar to Singapore or something like that. What do you think that means macroeconomically? Like, what impact would that have on the other financial centers and the cash flow, I guess, moving around the world?
I think that's a really interesting question, because we're kind of seeing two competing approaches to this technology develop, right? We're seeing kind of broadly across G7 economies, increasingly strict regulations. We're seeing more conversations about things like CBDCs. And then in emerging markets, we're seeing the opposite approach, right? We're seeing people looking to use this technology to leverage economic growth. And we're seeing broader adoption of Tether. So I think it's interesting from the perspective that you're going to get kind of two competing approaches over the next couple of years. I think that just from an investor and an issuer perspective, I think the approach that's developing in El Salvador and the AIFC are probably more attractive. I think that's really our focus. Is the securities law and processes has developed over, like 100 years. And there's been a lot of technical changes since then. And I think we have an opportunity in both of those markets to kind of start from scratch and say, okay, there's constituents within this ecosystem that we don't really need anymore, and that we can streamline the whole process and really create a system that's more geared towards servicing issuers and investors than protecting, the moats and territories that have been built up by various members of the capital markets infrastructure over the past couple of decades.
Okay, that's amazing. Jesse, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure picking your brain about tokenized securities and the potential future. Congratulations on Bitfinex Securities reaching its 2nd anniversary. And can you please give out your social media information or any pertinent links that have to do with Bitfinex Securities that our audience may want to know about?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, first of all, I would say sign up for Bitfinex Securities now. As I said, we've got a lot of exciting stuff coming in the 4th quarter, especially around El Salvador. So I think there's a non-zero chance we can get a real rush in investor signups. And it might be more difficult to join the platform kind of deeper into 4th quarter than it would be now. So I'd say get on that as soon as possible, create an account, and try and get ahead of that rush. I'd say, also follow us on Twitter, BFX Securities, at BFX Securities. And that's where we post most of our information and things that are relevant to the platform. And I also moonlight as the host of the Blockstream Talk podcast. So come check us out there. We have more conversations about Bitcoin and Bitcoin-based capital markets. So if you're interested in that, have a look.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on the show.
No, it's great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.